Sanbonani, welcome to The Conversation, a Hope Church production on race and justice. We do hope you find this episode, our fourth episode, very challenging, very fruitful or edifying. But please do engage with us. Watch this video and the second video, part 2, as we think through how do we engage on issues of race as Black and white Christians. Enjoy. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're watching this from. Welcome to another Hope Church conversation on race. Today, we're going to be focusing particularly on the rules of engagement when we talk about race, when we discuss and debate about race as Christians in the world. And on the panel joining me this morning, we've got Kiyu Mbebe, who was on the conversation last week. She's working on her PhD at the University of Pretoria. She works for the University of Pretoria, but most importantly, she is a member of a church in Pretoria, Christchurch Tshwane, a fellow Christian sister, and we look forward to discussing this together. We've also got Vera Mabach, a fellow Christian sister from Christchurch Midrand, who's been involved in a lot of race dialogues through Diversity Dialogue, and she's also involved with other Christian organizations like TGIF and Lepri, South Africa. And then we've also got Madalitso Phiri, a fellow Christian brother from True North in Midrand, and he's in sociology. So welcome, guys. Hope you're looking forward to speaking honestly to us about this. You can just maybe wave and relax. Yeah, so I think the topic, as I've said, is we're going to be thinking about the rules of engagement. So the two main things we're going to be trying to discuss is whether there's any difference as Christians engaging in this topic, whether there's any gospel distinction that needs to come through in the way that we speak into the topic, but also as Black and white Christians, whether there are any things we need to be aware of. So I think the first question we'll start off with is whether, as the church globally, and even in South Africa, our history, we have to admit, is not the most flattering. We have links to colonialism. Some of our churches were complicit in their silence during apartheid. Some of our churches structurally still struggle. You'll know that most of our diverse, so-called diverse churches are happy to submit to the leadership of a white pastor, but they find it hard to get a Black minister in there. Some of them, maybe the top management will be full of white management, and then the interns who change from year to year will be predominantly Black. So does this make us look like hypocrites whenever we try to speak on the issue of race? How would we respond to that? Madalitso?
I think we need to pay attention to the long history of race, racism, and white supremacy itself, and how it's actually shaped the church. And what do I mean by that? You can't have discussions around racism, white supremacy without whiteness and white people. So I think that's what we need to pay attention. That the global construct of how modernity has been conceptualized is a highly racialized project, and it's a project that has actually involved fragmentation, division, separation, and the hierarchization of the races, that white folks put themselves at the center of history, excluding all other members of society and the world. That project really shaped the church, and I would actually go as far as saying that it was birthed in the church on so many occasions. And partly, it's should I continue to say
No,
a
you
few
can
more
continue.
things? And I think it resounds from partly a very distinct Christianity, brand of Christianity that emerged from the 1500s up until the present.
Okay. But so That came out as well last week, the history of the church's participation in racism. Q mentioned and unpacked to us the doctrine of discovery and how demeaning that was to natives all over the world. But is there anything positive? Is it insulting or patronizing to try and blow the trumpet of the church's fight against racism? Or is that an acceptable defense? Vera, you're part of a diverse church in Midrand. How can we encourage people that maybe that is not a full picture of the church? There are some good stories. Or is that an unfair approach to take? Maybe Vera and Kio, you can weigh in on that.
Okay. Okay. Sure, you can go, Vera.
Kio. You go, Kio.
Okay. You know, when we say the church, this is a very, very broad, very ambiguous term, because the church is comprised of so many different kinds of people. You've got colonizer and colonized in the church. You've got you know, the conquered and the conquerors in the church. Then you've got all kinds of denominations with all kinds of convictions. That's what makes it difficult to just answer a question like this, saying that the church is just one way, you know? Beyond or did just one thing. The fact that when Europeans came to, when Europeans colonized South Africa, the fact that they did so at the behest and with the aid of missionaries, and the church being the, you know, the European church in general, whichever schisms they had going on there, means that the church is responsible for colonization and conquest. But the fact that colonized Christians fought back against this colonization and conquest means that in some part the church is also responsible for the pushback against racism. So I think we are in a very tough place because we just keep to this one term, the church. Well, the church is a lot of different kinds of people.
It's not a monolith. We don't all share. It's a colorful history. It's complex.
It's a very complex history. It's a complex institution. It's a global thing. So, yeah, I think what perhaps would be more helpful if we looked at the local church, the church in South Africa, or the churches in South Africa, Christianity as it developed in South Africa, rather than just this whole huge, broad term, the church.
Okay. Thanks. Vera, would you like to add?
Yeah, I really agree with that. There's a lot more complexity, and I think we have this tendency to stereotype. We have this tendency overall in the world, and we definitely also develop that in, you know, this is now the church, and we tend to stereotype people there as well. I think for me, there is value in looking back on history and saying this is where we've come from, this is where we are. But to me, the important thing is, what are we doing now? Because if we are carrying on with that colonial way of doing things and we are not changing, then we have a real problem. Then, you know, if the comments are justified, but it's about what we are doing now to try and live differently. I think one of the challenges, Ellis Potter, who was a Library worker, he says that the problem that we often experience in the church is that the world is the light of the church.
Okay.
Which is not what we're supposed to be doing.
We're supposed to be
the light.
Yeah.
Yes. And we are supposed to, as the church, supposed to be the light of the world.
Yeah.
So we should really be leading this this move away from a colonialism and the
Yeah.
colonialist kind of way of doing things.
Yeah, and I want to add a nuance to the question and look at that practical side of what are we doing today, Vera? Because sometimes when someone says, and they're basically saying, look at the log in your own eye, a Christian or a church member, is that through introspection, are there things we should be sorting out within ourselves as the church? And when we do that project of decolonizing, how far do we go? Some of us are from Reformed evangelical churches where the heritage is quite white, celebrating Puritans and the Reformers. And we're very sensitive. We're like, oh, don't touch our precious Puritans and the Reformers. So how do we go about that project? Is it just a superficial thing, or do we dig, into the core? How far do we go? I don't know who wants to jump into that first. Madalizo, you can maybe distinguish yourself if that wasn't an accurate description of you or of your church.
Yeah, certainly my church is Reformed, although I think increasingly, or it has Reformation inclinations, but I wouldn't necessarily identify with just that one specific tradition as the only way of experiencing and knowing Jesus. And I think one of the things that we need to do is that when we look at the theoretical constructs or understanding issues around racism, etc., in the church, is that we shouldn't think that a critique of whiteness, a critique of white Christianity, which is what had happened before when I did this in Reformed churches across in Cape Town, is a rejection of the Christian faith. We actually need to make that distinction, that one can actually be a follower of Jesus, to love Jesus, and still be able to critique whiteness and still be able to create imperial Christianity, right? So as much as we're talking about the distinctions between what type of church or the definitions of what we mean by church, we can actually go in when we start to say church history, we actually mean the history of the church as it was experienced in Western Europe. And that's a very problematic assumption. Christianity reached the African continent way before it did Western Europe. We all know that. It's factual. If we look at Acts, the conversion of the eunuchs and the eunuch and some folks that had actually encountered God through the power of the Holy Spirit, going back to Libya and Egypt and all those places. So what we're actually problematizing is the idea that a certain group of people monopolized power, monopolized knowledge, monopolized experiences of what it means to be human, and created a world for their own genetic survival. That is racism.
Okay.
Racism is the monopolization of one human experience for the genetic survival of a certain group of people. And that still continues to happen in the church. And why do I say that? Let's look at the elements of separation that actually took place, at least here in the South African context. That when Andrew Murray was setting up churches and missions in the Cape and moving into the interior.
Which denomination, can you just locate for us Andrew Murray? Who is he associated with? Which church?
Is associated, why am I forgetting?
Anyone else who can help us, if you can remember, if the name sounds familiar.
Is a missionary in the Cape, comes from the UK.
Okay.
Yeah, I can't put the specific denomination.
Unless he was with the London Missionary Society.
I think so, yeah. I think so.
Okay. Not that we're naming and shaming, but you can continue.
Okay, yeah. So in one way, that births the concept of separation, because it's at the point where the most important Christian ritual that brings all of us together through solidarity becomes, which is communion. They talk about. He suggested that there should be a separation, that natives should actually take communion differently from whites, right? So these are the very same ideas that birth different types and experiences of a native Christianity and a white Christianity. People even go to create distinctions of heaven itself, right? That this whole notion that concept of manifest destiny, that European nations have a right to rule, to dominate not only their own physical spaces, but the whole world, through God's mandate, like how God favored the English, etc. Those heretical teachings that we actually haven't actually come to terms with, and they solidified an ideology and a perspective of how the world should actually function.
Yeah.
Some of those ideas were actually birthed in the church itself, and they influenced, or not, they continue to impact how we do church
today.
And adding on that, the English missions only served to pave a way for the birth of apartheid through the theology of Abraham Kuyper and the solidification of Christian nationalism, right? And we can't say that now, because when post-1994, then all these things have actually gone away. These are powerful ideologies and ways of looking at the world that have privileged the white minority group in the world to live as a majority.
Yeah. So
in one sense, I don't actually subscribe to ideas around diversity, multiculturalism. Those are problematic concepts that do not actually add value to the project that Christ calls us to be, of being a new human.
Okay. That's interesting. Kiyo, I saw you were agreeing with that. You don't subscribe to multiculturalism and diversity. Can you just elaborate? Because I mean, we always push diversity in our churches. Let's be hospitable to people who are different. Let's be a diverse congregation.
I'm not. I don't want to speak for Mother Lizone. I'm speaking for me. So I'm picking up for me what I got from what he's saying. Let me first start with what Vera said about what we can do now. Okay, I think part of the problem is creating a now. Saying things like post-apartheid. Saying things like post-colonial. Post means after. We don't see substantial change in terms of either culturally or geographically or politically, the power balances from since apartheid. Look, when I was 5 years old, no one had to tell me or sit me down and say, hey, white people are better. I just saw it because I saw where we lived and I saw where they lived. I saw the kind of jobs they had and I saw the kind of jobs we had. That was just something that was, okay, well, this is the logic. White is better. We don't see anything much difference today. Who are the people who are getting brutalized like now in townships? It's black people, it's not white people. Who are the people who have an absence of military presence during COVID, even though, you know, we are under some sort of state of emergency, the state of disaster. There's an absence of military personnel in the suburbs where the white people are. Who are the bodies that we're seeing being dragged out of their shacks in so-called illegally occupied
land
areas? It's black people. So what tells a black child today born in a shack in Khayelitsha that you are now free? It's now post-apartheid. It's now post-colonization. It's post-colonial. The fact that the faces in government have changed does not mean that the power structures are much different. They still maintain the same kind of relationships between black and whites, and colored people and Indian people and so forth. Okay, so I just want to problematize this idea of this happened in the past. What do we do now about it? The past is still with us. There's no past that we can talk about, and unless we're talking just in terms of the passage of time, but not in the change of structures. And a lot of the times people confuse or conflate the two, that, well, that was before 94, so we don't live like that anymore. And that's not how history works. History is not the same as the past, right? Okay. We're still in history. We're making history. But we are not necessarily in the time of the past. But it's very important for us to realize where we draw these lines of what we mean by the past, where the past ends and where the present begins and where the future will begin. And that's partly what I look at in my my thesis on the TRC, that the TRC itself was talking about past injustice, and it was going on while there was still major political injustice in the country. The process was going on at that time. What did it mean for the TRC to be talking about addressing the past and the brutality of the past, when the brutality was happening real time as the
TRC process was happening?
As the process was happening. So in the same way, I think the church, and I only talk about my denomination because I don't know a lot about
don't name
denominations.
it. No, I was just saying don't name it.
Why?
Okay, no, it's free speech. This is not an oppressive regime.
No,
you can just speak.
You see, things don't change if we just think like it's. Who is it serving to not say I'm talking about VHSA? Who is it serving? That's the kind of questions you should ask yourself. Is it serving the people who feel marginalized in the denomination, or the people whose reputation needs to be protected from being named? Things like that tells you a lot about the power balances even in a congregation like ours. And it's obviously not unique to our congregation. And then just responding to what Madalita said about diversity and multiculturalism and transculturalism, every time, I swear to you, you know, there is something about being in a position of marginalization that makes you see things that if you're in a position of privilege, you don't. Or you're less likely to see. The fact that you're speaking English right now, you know, who sees it? It's not people whose first language is English. It's me, whose first language is not English. And so I can already see where the power is leaning. And so the type of music that we sing in our churches, who's made uncomfortable, who's made comfortable, who's made to get out of their comfort zones, who's not. So a lot of the times when we say multicultural or
diverse or transcultural,
diverse churches, we're actually saying white churches with people from different races in them.
Accommodating them.
We're saying Black people, Indian people, colored people, come join us as white people in our denomination. You can now, it's the whole, I think this is why I have a little bit of beef with MLK when he said that I have a dream that one day my, you know, black girls and boys will be holding hands with white girls and boys, and excuse me, because we all know where they'll be holding the hands. It's not going to be in a township somewhere. It's gonna, even this whole thing of access that came after 94, people are like, okay, now we can get into jobs, now we can go to beaches, now that is just assimilation. There's nothing, it's just integration. There's nothing, I want to say revolutionary, but I know, that word, it really just trips some people up.
It was a step forward, but not a big enough step.
Disturbs the status quo. It's basically, okay, this is how we can maintain power. We let you in, but we let these kinds of Black people in, or these kinds of colored people in, etc. So I share Madaliso's and discomfort just with hearing the words transcultural church, multicultural church. It's mostly a unique cultural church with diverse races in that church. A lot of the time, that's what I see anyway.
Okay. Thanks. Vera, any pushback? Are you more of a diversity optimist?
Well, I think, I hope and pray that diversity is a step towards integration. I don't think that diversity, just having a lot of different people in the room, necessarily means that we have solved the problems of racism. So I think, going back to the question about what can we do in our churches, again, I think we should be doing things in our churches first. We should be the ones who are the light of the world. So we should be having, looking at the structures that are in place. Who is leading the church? Is the lead pastor Black or white? Who are the people, the elders on the board, or whatever they're called? Who is playing the music in the front? Not, along with what music are we playing? What songs are we singing? I think one of my questions to a few people has been, what does a Black church look like? And to be honest, the answers that I get, to me, seem to be basically the same as what I think a white church looks like, just that people say, oh no, we'll go on for longer, we'll have more singing. And to me, that doesn't answer the question. They must, I do think that this idea, I think that what Chaos calls a unicultural church is the fact that most of the systems that are in place, the structures that we have, the way the service runs has been influenced by white culture. And even in Black townships, the kind of structure very often is the same. So I would love to know more about what does a truly South African church service look like? Does it mean we sit in the same way? Do we sit in an auditorium? Do we sit in a circle? Who does what? To me, there's a lot of scope for doing things differently and developing this idea.
Yeah, thanks, guys. Now the next question I want to look at is, as Christians, we want to be distinctly gospel-centered as we engage in race. And I know that Christians are diverse. Maybe that diversity in terms of our theologies isn't really reflected here. But some conservative Christians, not just white conservative evangelicals, but even some Black conservatives, are concerned that socialism or cultural Marxism is setting the agenda on the race debate through the way we analyze things, the way we look at things, that we're looking through a lens not of scripture, but more of critical race theory. This came up last week in the discussion, that we should be more critical of the humanities or of critical theory. Is
So-
that a fair dichotomy? As Christians, should we take more the Bible and let the Bible kind of unpack the way we view this issue, or is it acceptable for us to learn from? I mean, Madalito, Kiyo, you guys are in universities studying some of this stuff, but Christians sometimes are very suspicious and uncomfortable. How do we reassure them? Vera, you started on the point of the church being the light, but some Christians are concerned that the humanities or universities or critical thinkers are setting the tone. They are the light, guiding everyone, including the church. So Vera,
So, can I say something before?
yeah, Madalito, that's fine.
Okay. So I think you are referring to an article that was written by somebody in the from the Gospel Coalition, right? That spoke about that. I saw that, which I felt that it was very shallow and pretty much did not engage with the content.
Can I just clarify
having-
something, Madalito? Gospel
Yeah.
Coalition, the American one, or Gospel Coalition Africa?
The American one.
Okay.
Yeah, so there was an article that was shared there. I think one of the things that we need to establish is, why is it that certain knowledge regimes are preferred over others? That's a rhetorical question. And another issue to consider is that, why should Black folk continue to explain themselves when nothing about the racialized project was actually of their own doing? Blacks never colonized anyone. Blacks never went to the distant parts of the world and claimed that we want to control this territory. It's never happened before. The only civilization that has actually existed and claimed a monopoly of the whole world and influences cultural, political, social, and economic systems and religious traditions is Europe. And I'm actually extending, I'm meaning Europe in its diversity, like, you know, the Euro-American world, including the US. So we need to be suspicious that when people are looking at some of these criticisms that Christianity or cultural Marxism has actually set the tone, whatever, it's coming from a shallow understanding and a shallow engagement with critical social theory, that they've not actually engaged with the people that have written from that critical tradition. I think that's the first point to consider. And it's really important, because it's about the policing of knowledge regimes.
The policing.
Yeah. So for you guys that went to Bible college at George Whitfield College, if you ask yourself, did you ever come across the writings of James Cone? Somebody will say, oh no, don't actually engage with the Black radical tradition or Black theology, because that's problematic. Did you actually read Lutuli, Let My People Go? Oh no. That is very problematic. You know, did you read Giteres? Did you read, I can, go on and on and on. But who's policing that? That's whiteness policing what you should know. White folks have actually interpreted the faith in a very specific way that has worked for their own survival. The creation of the nation state, the creation of democratic institutions, the creation, this idea of separating church from state, etc. All of that, yeah.
Yeah. So there's something that's been coming up repeatedly. Vera, I want you to weigh in on this. When we say white folks have created, or have collaborated or have set things up for their genetic survival. I think it does add to these concerns from Christians. Is that an overstating of the point? Does it sound like a conspiracy that, you know, all white people have collaborated
But
to set things up for their benefit?
Can I just finish? And
Yeah.
I wanted to actually go into the empirical examples of where that has actually happened.
Yeah.
Right. Because if we look at the historical formation of South Africa, if we want to look at the world, how it actually works, let's look at South Africa. Right. In terms of, you know, the organization of church, politics, institutions, separation, you know, and to go back to my point earlier on, that was a project of whiteness. So this is not like an overstatement. It's a historical fact, right? That the moment we create the idea of a citizen and a subject in South Africa, citizen is meant to be experienced for white folks with all these civil rights and the civil law. And the subject, who is a native, exists in a zone of customary law, constrained to the labor reserves, and to continue to be a provision of to sustain the white system, economic system that has actually been created. We can see that empirically, right?
Yeah.
Now, I'm saying that knowledge helps us to make sense of ourselves. But because certain groups of people have created a knowledge and made their standards to be the norm, they don't see where other folks are coming from. Okay. So I've always said that my argument is all the institutions that were created by whiteness, theologically, systematically, they are wrong. They're heretical. There has to be a repentance from that some of the institutions that we actually allowed continued to fuse even in the church. The very same people who were saying, no, you know, cultural Marxism and, you know, critical race theory is influencing the church. Their own perspective is wrong. People fused social Darwinism with Christian theology to justify domination. So the idea that certain groups and races needed to overpower the rest of the world came from a Darwinian thinking. And like, you know, Charles Darwin was talking about the origins of the species, and then there was social Darwinism, that socially Europeans need to continue to dominate the rest of the world. And that found itself in the church. And that same perspective, when we say, actually, some of the helpful tools to understanding humanity have been given by social scientists, critical theorists. Let's learn from them.
Okay.
As a pool of, you know, God's common grace,
God's
and
common grace,
understand, and the commons, But we're frowning on that because it doesn't resonate with the racisms that have been internalized in our racialized project.
Can I bring in Vera, and then Kiyo, you can also get into this discussion. Vera, in terms of the worldview that's unpacking and the lens through which we're looking at things, do you have anything to add as the church setting the light? How discerning are we?
Sure. I think that one of the things that we often have a problem with is that we have this secular sacred divide, and we see this part of our lives as the Christian part and this part as the secular part. And if we have that kind of view of ability, then it can lead towards a rejection of that kind of work that's been done, because we say this is secular and we cannot take that into the church. Whereas I think we should be coming from a point of view where all of life is under God's lordship, and there is, as you say, common grace, and there is learning, and there is so much truth in other ways of studying things that we can have a look at that, and we can say, okay, now how, looking at that and outside rejecting it, but just looking at it from my Christian point of view, what does my belief in God say about the same topic? What does the Bible say about it? And I think if we really go down to the nitty gritty, we will often see a lot of commonalities that we might otherwise miss. Yeah, so I think that, but I still feel that we really need to be looking at where we are in the church now, given the influence of history, and say, what are we going to change about this? Where are we really going to apply the gospel to all of life, even the structures that we've just taken on? And I do think that means that in those settings, we have to have some hard conversations, and we need to come to them with a greater awareness of ourselves and of other people. So this idea that I, as a white person, come into a conversation with an awareness of the fact that often white people take more airtime than black people, and that I am more aware, that I listen more instead of talking more, that I am aware of who's in the room and the language that we're speaking, and the fact that I am called to be like Jesus, who gave up his privilege when he was with the Father and he was, God everywhere almighty, condensed himself into the body of a human, and then came and washed people's feet and died on the cross and experienced severe pain. All these things that are so different from his life outside of a human body as God. So if I'm called to do similar things, then I need to be more aware of how my privilege works its way out usually